The bus had been moving for exactly 11 minutes when the driver pulled to the side of Ridge Road and opened the door. It was 6:47 in the morning on a Thursday in October. The man in seat 14 billion had not said a word since boarding. He had paid his fare 4 cetus exact and taken the window seat near the back the way a person takes a seat they have earned. He had folded his hands over the leather briefcase on his lap and looked out at the road. That was all. The driver stood up from his seat and pointed toward the open door and said the thing he said loud enough for the whole bus to hear. The man did not argue. He stood slowly, the way a person stands who has spent a long time learning to stand slowly, and walked down the 3 steps onto the gravel shoulder of Ridge Road. The door closed behind him. Nobody on that bus knew what was inside the briefcase, but one person in the city of Accra already did, and that person had been waiting for that briefcase for 22 years. His name was Kwadwo Asante Mensah, and he was 76 years old and weighed 61 kilograms on the morning of that Thursday, which was 23 kilograms less than he had weighed on the morning his wife Abina died 3 years and 4 months ago. He had not made a decision to stop eating. The decision had made itself. He stood on the gravel shoulder of Ridge Road with the briefcase in both hands and waited for the red lights of the bus to disappear around the bend. When they did, he looked down at his shoes. They were the same black leather shoes he had bought from a cobbler on Okaishi Street in 1989 for 12,000 old cedis. A man named Asare had resold them twice, once in 2004 and once in 2017. The heels had been worn down again since 2017, but the leather on the upper still held. He had polished them with a cloth and a tin of kiwi the evening before at the roadside guest house in Sawam, where he had paid 22 cedis for one night and asked the woman at the desk for a basin of hot water and been given cold water in a plastic bucket. His suit was gray, single-breasted, cut from worsted wool in 1991 at a tailor on Kojo Thompson Road, whose name he could no longer remember. It had been pressed flat with a damp cloth last night before the cold water came. The collar of his white shirt was frayed at the edge near the second button, and the cuffs were beginning to pull at the stitching. Both were clean. He had washed them by hand at the guest house basin and let them dry on the window grill overnight. The briefcase was dark brown leather, the kind that had started as tobacco-colored and gone dark with years of handling. It had 2 brass clasps and a small dent on the left clasp, the shape of a half moon. That had been there since 1987, when his daughter Akua, who had been 4 years old at the time, knocked it off the kitchen table while chasing a gecko across the floor. The briefcase had been a gift from his wife Abena on the day he was called to the bar in 1974. She had saved for 11 months to buy it. It had been to every court in Ghana. It had been to London twice and Nairobi once. It had sat beside him at a desk for 31 years while he read files and signed orders and made decisions that changed the direction of people's lives without any of those people ever knowing his name. He did not set it down on the gravel. He had not set it down on any surface he could not see clearly since he left the village of Juapong 6 days ago. What was inside it was not his. That was the thing he kept thinking about as the last of the bus fumes settled and the sound of Ridge Road traffic began to reach him from both directions. It had never been his. It had always been theirs. 847 families whose names he had written into a document by hand over the course of 4 days in March, sitting at a table in a room with no working fan, because the case had been waiting for 22 years, and he had been waiting too, and the right moment does not announce itself. It simply arrives. He had arrived with it. He needed to reach the National Land Commission office on Cantonments Road before 9 a.m. It was 6:51. He had no phone. The last bus he could catch going in the opposite direction left this stop at 8:10. He was 7.3 kilometers from Cantonments Road. He picked up the briefcase and began to walk. The reason the driver had asked him to leave was a woman named Blessing Ose, who was seated in 12A and had turned to the man in 13A, a man in a blue Lacoste shirt who was already putting in his earbuds, and said, quietly but not quietly, that something smelled very bad. She had said it once and then again with a wrapper pulled over her nose. She was 43 years old and had false nails in a pale pink and a phone with a cracked screen she had been scrolling when the old man boarded. She had not looked at his face at the terminal. She had looked at his shoes. The driver's name was Prince. He was 28 years old and had been driving the Accra to Tema shuttle for 11 months for a company called Swift Go Transit. The company had a sign above the driver's seat that read, "Passengers' comfort is our first priority." Prince had read it every morning for 11 months. When Mrs. Ose called to him through the seats, he pulled over at the Ridge Road lay-by and stood up and pointed. He did not raise his voice. He said the old man was causing discomfort. He said the old man should take the next bus. He said it the way a person says a policy rather than a decision, without looking at the face of the person he was speaking to. The man in the blue Lacoste shirt in 13A looked out the window. A woman in the third row opened her phone camera, angled it toward the aisle, then lowered it without pressing anything. A boy of about 15 seated at the back pressed his forehead against the window glass and said nothing. 4 other passengers looked at the floor, at their phones, at the ceiling vent above their heads. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Not one of them had seen what was written on the first document inside the briefcase. Not one of them had read the name on the cover page, or understood what the 9 attached signatures meant, or knew that 847 families in the Volta region had been waiting since 2003 for the piece of paper that was now sitting in a dark brown briefcase on the gravel shoulder of Ridge Road at 6:49 in the morning. The door of the Swift Go Transit bus closed with a hiss of air. The morning sun in October in Accra comes low and hard from the east, and by 7:04, it was already sitting at the level of windshields and had begun to bounce off the bonnets of the slow-moving traffic on Ridge Road in a way that made every surface look polished and hot. The air smelled of diesel and morning dew on poured concrete, and somewhere underneath both, the faint sweetness of roadside bread just out of a coal pot. Kwadwo Mensah walked on the right-hand shoulder with the briefcase in his left hand and his right hand free, the way he had always walked roads when he needed to think. He had walked 8 kilometers the morning before, from the guest house in Nsawam to the bus stop, because the trotro that usually ran that route had broken down and nobody could say when the next one was coming. His left knee had been giving him 40 minutes of warning before it locked up for the past 2 years, ever since he slipped on wet tile at the village health post while carrying a bench for the waiting area. It had given him 40 minutes of warning this morning at 6:30. It was now 7:04. He had 26 minutes before the knee made the decision for him. He stopped at a provision kiosk where a woman was counting change into a ceramic bowl and asked if she knew any taxi passing toward cantonments. She looked at him for a moment, at his face, not at his suit, and said taxis did not usually come this way in the morning. She said he should try the roundabout 500 meters ahead. She reached under her counter and handed him a sachet of water without him asking, and waved off the coin he held out. The water was cold and tasted of plastic, and he drank all of it in 4 swallows and thanked her and walked on. He reached the roundabout at 7:18. 3 taxis idled at the near side. The first driver quoted him 35 cedis. Kwadwo had 17 cedis and 40 pesos in his left breast pocket in an envelope he had sealed in Juapong before leaving. He told the driver 17. The driver rolled up his window without another word. The second driver asked where he was going, listened, and said, 28 cedis. The third taxi had a cracked rear windscreen and a rosary hanging from the rearview mirror, and a driver who was eating kenki from a black plastic bag with one hand and listening to City FM on a phone propped against the dashboard. His name was Otto. Otto said 15 cedis and did not ask about the smell. He moved the kenki bag to the floor, cleared the passenger seat, and pulled into traffic. The inside of Otto's car smelled of engine oil and the banana leaf wrapping of the kenki, and something sharp underneath both, which Kwadwo identified after a moment as camphor. There was a crack running diagonally across the dashboard that had been filled with black electrical tape. The fuel gauge showed a needle resting just above the red line. The radio said there was an accident on the N1 and advised drivers to divert through Shiashi. Otto did not react to this news. He drove with his left elbow out the window and his right hand loose on the wheel and said nothing except when he needed to, which was twice, once to ask which gate on cantonments and once, quietly, to say they were close. They reached the junction near the National Land Commission office on Cantonments Road. At 7:54 a.m., the gate was there. The signboard was there, but the guard at the gate was young. His ID badge still bright and unscratched, the plastic still with its factory shine, and he said something that made Kwadwo's hand tighten around the handle of the briefcase. The commission had moved. The new office was on Liberation Road near the airport roundabout, 4.7 kilometers in the opposite direction. The office had moved 6 weeks ago. There was a laminated paper sign on the gate. He was sorry. It was 7:57. Quadwo had 12 cetus, and 40p cetus was remaining. Otto had not driven away. He was still sitting at the gate, with the engine running, and the kinky bag on the floor. And when Quadwo turned from the gate, Otto was looking at him through the passenger window. He said nothing. Then, after a moment, the new office. If this story is reaching you the way I think it is, subscribe now. Because what happens when Quadwo walks through the second gate changes the entire direction of everything you think you understand about this morning. Otto drove without taking the remaining 12 CDs. He said he had a mother in Adenta who had carried important things a long way once, and he left it at that. He pulled up at Liberation Road at 8:14 a.m. and pointed at the building and told Quadwo to go straight inside and not stop at the desk on the left. The reception hall of the National Land Commission's new office on Liberation Road was cool with air conditioning and had blue plastic chairs arranged in a row, and a woman behind a desk with a name tag that said, Constance in gold lettering on black. Constance looked at Quadwo's suit and then at the briefcase and asked who he had an appointment with. He said he did not have an appointment. He said he had a filing that needed to be received before 9 a.m. Constance looked at her screen. She said the senior officer who handled Volta region filings was not in yet. She said he was expected at 9. Quadwo said he understood. He sat down in one of the blue plastic chairs near the window that faced Liberation Road and placed the briefcase on his lap and folded both hands over the clasp. He was sitting there at 8:21 when a woman came through the glass door of the building walking fast and stopped when she saw him. She stopped the way a person stops when they see something they had given up expecting to see. Her name was Abina Owusu-Boateng, and she was 51 years old, and she was the director of land titling and registration at the National Land Commission, a position she had held for 7 years. She was carrying a brown leather satchel and a cup of coffee in a travel mug and had not yet taken off her reading glasses. She wore a dark blue kaba and slit and had her hair pulled back, and she was 3 minutes early, which was how she always arrived. She had last seen Quadwo Asante Mensah at a funeral in Accra in 2019. Before that, at a seminar at the Ghana School of Law in 2016. Before that, she had seen him almost every week for 5 years between 1998 and 2003, because for those 5 years, she had been a junior legal officer in the Land Disputes Division, and he had been the most senior voice in every room he entered, not by title at that time, but by the kind of authority that does not need a title, the kind that other people feel before they can explain why. She had grown up in a house in the Volta region on soil her grandfather had farmed for 40 years, and whose title her grandfather was told he did not have, and whose case had sat in a filing drawer for 11 years before a judge with a quiet voice and a dark brown briefcase told a room of opposing lawyers that the evidence was not ambiguous, and the law was not ambiguous, and the only thing that had been ambiguous for 11 years was whether anyone in that building intended to apply either one. That judge had been Quadwo Asante Mensah, retired Chief Justice of the High Court of Ghana, who had then in the same year filed the original land claim for 847 families across the Volta region and shepherded it through every layer of the system for the better part of 2 decades. She had thought for the past 4 months that the case had gone cold. She had been told by the current administrator, by 2 lawyers on the opposing side, by the records office on 3 separate occasions that the original notarized title documents had been destroyed in the 2022 flooding that damaged the Juapong District Court archive. She had filed a new inquiry each time she received that reply. Each time the reply came back the same. She had not been told that Quadwo had found them. He had found them in a sealed waterproof envelope inside a metal box wedged into the roof space of the district court clerk's home, where the clerk's late wife, a woman named Akua Amoa, who had worked at the court as a cleaner for 19 years, and who had understood the way certain people understand things without being told, had placed them in August of 2022 when she heard the rain beginning on the corrugated roof and went looking for what needed saving. Abina Owusu-Boateng crossed the reception hall in 8 steps and stood in front of the blue plastic chair. She looked at the briefcase in his lap. She looked specifically at the small half-moon dent on the left brass clasp. She had heard about that dent during a case review in 2021. in the way that certain identifying details about important documents pass from one officer to the next, like coordinates, and she said his name. Kwadwo Mensah looked up from the window. There was a long moment between them that Constance at the desk would later describe to her colleague as the quietest she had heard that lobby in 7 years. Then Abina sat down in the chair beside him, not the chair across from him, and lowered her satchel and her coffee to the floor and said quietly, "How far have you come?" He said Juapong. He said 6 days. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Come upstairs." The document on her desk was not the only item in the briefcase. There were 9 additional certified copies, one for each regional coordinating council in the affected districts, each signed and witnessed and sealed with the notarization stamp of a commissioner of oaths whose certification was valid under the Land Title Registration Act. There was also a letter, 1 page, handwritten in blue ink, addressed to the families of the Volta region land communities, all 847 of them listed in 4-point font across both sides of 2 A4 pages, from a man who had spent 22 years carrying their names the way a person carries water in dry season, carefully, both hands, without spilling. Abina Owusu Boteng stood from her desk and walked to her office door and said 3 words to her assistant in the corridor. "Get legal down here." The 4 people who arrived in the office over the next 20 minutes did not all know Kwadwo Mensah's face. 2 of them recognized the name before they saw him. 1 recognized the briefcase before the name, but what each of them did when they came through the door was the same. They looked at the man sitting in the chair beside the desk, with the worn gray suit and the resoled shoes and the hands folded flat on his knees, and they became very still and very correct in the way that people become still and correct when they understand they are standing in the presence of something larger than themselves. The administrator who had told Abina 3 times that the documents were lost arrived at 9:03. He came in quickly, the way people come in who have been summoned to know it. When he saw what was spread across the desk, he stopped walking. His right hand was still on the doorframe. He looked at the documents, then at Abina, then at the man in the chair. He did not speak. Abina said, "These are the originals." The administrator said something about the flood report. Abina said, "Yes." Then nothing else. By 10:15 a.m., the filing had been received, logged, time-stamped, and transmitted to the 3 senior officers whose authorization was required to advance the claim to its final resolution stage. This process had taken, in previous attempts on related cases, between 6 and 18 months. The Director of Land Titling and Registration authorized a priority review schedule, which moved the timeline to 9 working days. By 11:30 a.m., a press statement was being drafted by the communications team of the Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources, who had been notified at 9:47 a.m. The statement described the recovery of original title documents for 847 families in 6 Volta region communities and announced the commencement of final resolution procedures. It did not contain the name of the man who had carried those documents from Juapong to Accra in 6 days on foot, and by trotro and by a taxi with a cracked windscreen and a rosary on the rearview mirror. Kwadwo had not asked for his name to be in it. At 12:10 p.m., Abena came back into the room where Kwadwo was still sitting and placed a cup of tea on the table beside his chair, a proper chair at the conference table on the 2nd floor, where she had asked him to wait 2 hours earlier and where he had sat without asking for anything. She sat across from him and said, 847 families. He said, "It took too long." She said, "You brought it." He picked up the tea with both hands. It was hot. He did not put it down. The Swift Go Transit Company received a formal complaint filed that same afternoon to the Greater Accra Regional Transport Authority, citing the incident on Ridge Road at 6:47 a.m. The complaint was filed by Otto, who had sat outside the Land Commission building on Liberation Road until 11 a.m. on his day off, because he had decided before he drove away that he wanted to know how the story ended. The company's compliance officer opened an investigation within 48 hours. The driver, Prince, was suspended pending review. The company issued a statement regarding passenger dignity protocols and announced a mandatory company-wide retraining program for all drivers beginning on the first Monday of November. The first session was held at the Swift Go Depot on Dazorwulu Road, 3 blocks from the lay-by on Ridge Road, where the door of Bus 14 had closed at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday in October. Prince thought he was removing a problem from a bus. What he was removing was a man who had spent 31 years making decisions that changed the lives of people who never knew his name, and then spent 3 years after his wife died returning quietly to finish the last one, because he had started something that had not finished, and he was not the kind of person who left things unfinished. You cannot remove a person's purpose by moving them off a seat. You can close the door, you can roll the window up, you can look at the shoes and decide everything you think you need to decide, but you cannot take out of a person what they have already given everything to carry. The world keeps its accounts in strange ledgers. The man who smelled of 6 days of travel, who had 17 setties and 40 peso was in a sealed envelope, and a knee that gave him 40 minutes of warning, was carrying the resolution to a wrong that had been sitting in a government filing system since 2003. He did not carry it for a title or for recognition or for anything that would be written anywhere with his name on it. He carried it because 847 families had his word, and 22 years was already too long. That is the kind of person who gets removed from buses. That is also the kind of person who changes things. There is a kind of strength that does not need to announce itself. It wears the same gray suit for 30 years and polishes the same shoes twice and keeps its word when no one is watching and no one is counting, and the rain has already started. The world regularly mistakes this kind of strength for weakness because it does not perform, because it does not demand, because it continues quietly past the point where performance and demand have long given up. This is the mistake the world makes over and over, and the world is almost always corrected. Kwadwo Asante Mensah went back to Juapong by bus on the Friday after the filing. He paid 4 cedis for the window seat near the back the way a person pays for a seat they have earned. He placed the briefcase on his lap and folded his hands over the clasp, over the small half-moon dent, and looked out at the road. The briefcase was lighter now. He had carried the documents out of it, and they were where they needed to be. He had 6 days of fatigue in his body, and a knee that was giving him steady warning, and the warmth of a cup of tea on his palms that he could still feel when he pressed his hands together. By the following Tuesday, 3 community leaders from the Volta region had received notification letters. By the Thursday after that, the number was 41. By the end of that month, 847 families across 6 communities had received official notice of the final resolution process, commencing on their behalf. He did not make any calls to follow up. He had left Abina his niece's phone number in Juapong, and he trusted it. He went back to the village and waited, and while he waited, he did what he had always done. He read and he walked the road in the evening when the air cooled, and sometimes he sat on the step of the house and looked at the briefcase in the corner and thought about Abina, his wife, not the director. Saving for 11 months in 1973 to buy it, not knowing then what it would one day be asked to carry or how far. Now I want to ask you something. I want you to sit with it before you answer. If you were on that bus that Thursday morning, not the driver, not Mrs. Oze in seat 12A, but one of the passengers who looked away, who put in their earbuds, who pointed a phone camera and then lowered it, and you found out 1 hour later what was inside that briefcase and what it meant, and who the man in that gray suit had spent 22 years becoming, what would you do with that knowledge? Not what would you say, not what would you post. What would you actually do? Leave your answer in the comments. I really do want to read it. Subscribe for more stories about hidden strength, quiet power, and the people the world overlooks until they change everything. I'll see you in the next one.